Hello and welcome back to the Healing for the Heart podcast, People Just Like Us, where we do really chat to people who are just like us, and we hear about their life and we hear about what they're doing, and we look at that in connection with mental and emotional health. So we want to welcome you here. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube, then why don't you hit the like button on it, or even the share button, and let people know that we're here. If you like what you see here and you fancy being part of this too, then do get in touch with us, and we're happy to create a space for you here, and you can come and do some podcast recording with us. I am delighted today to be joined by Jenny, and Jenny has been doing some work with us at Healing for the Heart. She doesn't work for Healing for the Heart, but she's been doing some work with us over the last wee while, and I'm excited to hear what Jenny is going to bring into this conversation today. So Jenny, why don't you tell us a wee bit about yourself and how you got to be here today, apart from the fact that I phoned you and said, would you like to do this?
For sure. So I trained as a musician, and I came to Glasgow about 25 years ago and never went away. And so that really informs the work that I do today. So my main job is as a choir director. I run a variety of choirs across Greater Glasgow, mainly in disadvantaged areas. I have a real passion for seeing those who are disadvantaged in lots of different ways, being able to embrace the arts and the good health that comes from being involved in singing. And I have a little side hustle of teaching yoga. So that's what I've been doing with Healing for the Heart.
Fabulous. So tell us a bit about the whole disadvantage thing. What do you mean by that?
Primarily, it manifests in being disadvantaged financially. So the areas I work in would be amongst the poorest in the UK, actually, in some instances. But along with that financial disadvantage comes all sorts of other disadvantage: educational disadvantage, literacy disadvantage, disadvantage in the way that people have been parented and then are able to parent. So it kind of knocks on into everything, but it really comes down to that financial disadvantage in the first place.
Yeah, cool. So you run choirs in these areas and all across the city. So I'm thinking that some people who are watching this are thinking choirs, and they're just about to press the stop button. Don't want to hear any more of that, because there's perhaps not been the most positive connotation round about singing as they've grown up. So how do you dispel that myth then?
Yeah, it's tricky, because I meet a lot of people every week who say, oh, well, I can't sing. And that's just wrong, because we can all sing. Like, whether we sing according to what other people want to hear is a different question. And in the West, we're very lined up to say, well, music is about achieving things. So you learn to play an instrument, you do the pages book by book, and then maybe you take exams, and all that kind of stuff. So we view music and singing through a lens of what can I achieve through this, and can I do it properly? And actually, like in other parts of the world, music is just about making a noise and having a go. And so that is kind of what we try to instill in all of our choirs. Like, our tagline is, if you want to sing, we want you. Find your voice, because everybody has a voice that can be found. And there are some people in my choirs who would people might listen to and say, well, you're not a great singer, but that is not the point at all. The point is that you join your voice, whatever that voice is, with other people. And actually, there are always things. It's very rare to meet somebody who's properly tone deaf. The problem is that at school, certainly years and years ago, I hear a lot of stories about, well, when I was at school and I wanted to join the choir, and the teacher went along the line and said, yes, yes, no, or yes, yes, you need to mime, or whatever. And that's super, super difficult for people to get over, actually, and it follows them their whole life. And I have, women, most often women in their 60s and 70s and 80s sometimes, who've never sung their whole lives because they were told something at primary school, and then they come and join one of our groups and they find a complete joy and maybe a release and a bit of healing in and about that as well.
Yep. So you've mentioned the connection between emotional health, and now you've mentioned that word healing. So do you want to tell us a wee bit more about that? What do you see this? Because it's not just about making a noise. It's not just about even finding your voice. What's the byproduct of all of this then?
Well, so singing actually changes your brain chemistry. Like your hormone levels actually change when you sing. So you get the endorphins that you get naturally from having a good time, that kind of thing. But also you get increased levels of oxytocin, which is a hormone that connects us to one another. It's what mums and babies experience. And so when we sing together, those levels rise and we become more connected to the people around about us. So not only does it actually physiologically make you feel better and good, it actually brings that sense of connection that we're so desperate for, especially after the last couple of years. So you're making gains on so many different levels. People don't always necessarily believe that until they come along. And usually with a choir, I'll have a check-in at the beginning. How do you feel on a scale of 1 really miserable to 10 totally ecstatic? Just keep that number to yourself, and then at the end we'll do the same. And it's very rare that people's mood and general feeling of happiness haven't gone up as they do it.
Yep. So what sort of stuff do people sing when they come to you?
Everything is very contemporary, super accessible, nothing highbrow. I mean, occasionally with some choirs I might throw something in that's a bit more challenging just because people like to do that. But with most of the choirs, it's, we just started a new set this morning. It includes Proud Mary and a little bit of Ed Sheeran. And, it's stuff that people can just sing along with and get on board with very easily. There's nothing that puts people off, nothing that people go, oh, well, a person like me couldn't sing a song like that. It's all what you'd hear on the radio. Yeah.
So what then, what kind of things have you experienced there? I don't necessarily mean personally, but even round about the stuff that you've been working with, what you see in round about that in terms of mental and emotional health?
I mean, I think because obviously we've all been locked down for the last couple of years, but singing took a bit more of a hit because fairly early on they decided that singing was a kind of super spreader event, which, to be honest, the evidence and the studies since don't really show that, but I'm not going to the nuts and bolts of it. But it's been difficult to get back to singing. It's taken a lot of effort. We found that all our choirs are significantly smaller than they were. So in the last 6 months, we've worked really hard to build those numbers up again so that people feel confident to come. I think people have a lot less capacity for everything now. I think everything feels a much bigger deal. And so we're fighting against that all the time to come back. But when people come back, their emotional response is really interesting. So a year ago, we went back and did our first residentials with young people again. And I worked with an amazing group of adult singers who are the team on those residentials. And the minute we started singing on those camps, the team cried, and they cried for the next 4 days as we led these kids. And the kids were a little bit unfazed by it. They were like, why are you all greeting again? But actually, every time it happened, and I've experienced that in all the choirs, people are really emotional when they're allowed to let their voice out. I think there's been a big silencing, and I think wearing masks is really it's a symbol of that, isn't it? It's been difficult to hear one another, to understand one another, to connect with one another, and suddenly we're allowed to take the masks off, we're allowed to let our voice come out, and that is really emotional. We hold a lot of emotion in our bodies and in our voices as well. So there is just a real sense of a release and a healing and a reclaiming of all of those things that comes back when we sing together.
Yeah. So are you finding then that there's an upsurge of interest in the choirs?
A little bit. So I've just started running a choir in Newton Mearns, which obviously is not disadvantaged, so it falls well outside my usual patch. But when we started that choir in February, we had over 50 people on the first night, which is unheard of. Now that may be because it's a slightly different area and a slightly different world to live in, but in areas like that, people were just desperate to get back to doing something. Some of the more challenging areas, it's more challenging to get people out again because their confidence, which was low to begin with, is less. So,
And you mentioned your side hustle. So how does the yoga and the singing go together?
I think that singing and yoga are really a lot more linked than I realised before. So yoga really means joining together. So it's not anything like weird or mystical particularly. It's just joining your breath to your body's movements and joining your mind in with that, rather than kind of this divorce that we do all the time of, well, my body is over here and my mind is over here. So when we become fully embodied and fully present, and I mean, that's just an amazing thing to be able to do because we don't do it as humans very often. But singing does those things as well. So the breathing is quite similar, the way that we use our bodies, to support another part of us. In singing, obviously, the voice, it's all connected. So I think I think there's a piece of work to be done on how we can combine the two, and I do that to some extent. It's easier with children because they go, oh, we'll do tree and sing as well. Like, they don't really mind it, whereas adults are like, well, what are you doing now? But I think there's a piece of work that could connect the two together. There's definitely some links.
I think it's really interesting because, well, obviously you don't unless you've listened to them, but lots of folks who come on the discussion that we end up in these podcasts ultimately often lands on that connection thing and the disconnect that's often there for people. You know, whether it's the disconnect between your body and your mind and your breath and your spirit or whatever, whether it's all of that disconnect because we've separated ourselves out into bits, or whether it's the disconnection between people or the disconnection between services or the disconnect, you know, whatever it is, that word disconnection seems to come up an awful lot. So within the stuff that you do, is that something that is a focus for you then, and how is that a focus, or is it not a focus? Is it just a byproduct?
I think it's a focus that's almost subconscious for me now, because I can see it happening. And so because I'm a teacher by trade, everything I do and have done since I left college and even before that is all about teaching. So I think responding to where you see a disconnect and helping people to join the dots with those things, I think that's probably part of my DNA and what I naturally do. And when you see people get it, when they go, oh, that works with that and that's because of that, and if I do this then, and all of that stuff, it lights people up. They get such a sense of achievement and satisfaction from doing that. And when that also includes a way to connect with the person next to you as you learn together and share the experience, I mean, it's magic, really.
Yeah, there's something really powerful in connection. And what that does to us, and it's not even at a subconscious level what that does to us. It almost sounds like some of the stuff that you're talking about with that connection and the reconnection stuff. We would obviously work a lot with attachment stuff here and attachment wounds, and it almost sounds as if there's an implicit way of doing that then via the stuff that you're doing, you know, so you're not necessarily coming for a counselling or a therapy session, but actually I suppose the end goal may well be very similar.
Yeah, I think there's a whole thing around that attachment and that like reattaching to yourself, because we become disattached, that's not even a word, is it? But you know what I mean, we become separated from ourselves very quickly, and the world wants to separate us from our body and tell us things about our body, and so then we talk about our body as an it and a separate entity, and actually in coming back to that, certainly I did some trauma sensitive training with the yoga, and that is just mind-blowing, the way that we become detached from our bodies, and how people who've experienced many levels of trauma actually they can't sense their bodies. They like you could put something in their hands and they wouldn't be able to tell you what it is because they're so detached. And I find that mind-blowing. But what for me is even more mind-blowing is that just by being involved in yoga, just by coming and singing, you can start to let yourself reintegrate. And I mean, there are amazing therapy centers in America that are doing work around that and really integrating yoga as part of the full counselling and mental well-being package, and singing as well, and seeing the difference that begins to make. So I'm excited to see certainly what my work with you guys can look like, and whether that could have an impact here as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So I know that there'll be people who are watching this who, when they hear the word yoga, don't actually want to participate in any of that or don't want to be part of it, because yoga historically has had connotations round about particular faiths or particular belief systems. And I know that we've chatted about that, and we've talked about, so for us here, it's actually about what the teacher is bringing into the yoga that's really, really important.
Yeah, I think it's a misunderstanding that attaches yoga to any religious system, because actually yoga predates all the kind of major religious systems that we have in the world today. And so for me, I liken yoga to something like a discipline like prayer or fasting, if that's your bag, or, anything that we would use in Christianity, is used by other religions as well, just in a different direction. So for me, yoga's no different. For me, it helps me to still myself, to come back in touch with my body, to remember who God made me to be, and go on from there.
Yeah.
So it can be a contemplative practice. I think it can also be a worshipful practice if that's where you want to go. And my training was with Holy Yoga, which is an American organization that, you know, it's completely Jesus-centered all the way through. So there was no sense of being drawn into something that I didn't feel comfortable with as I was training. And now, you know, I use it sometimes just as yoga, but there are occasions when I bring the Bible into that, where I bring ideas about that God might have about you into that. We just used it on camp with our team as the devotional in the morning, and that was an amazing thing to do.
Yeah, I think the thing about connection is really, really important. I didn't know that that's what yoga meant, that it meant connected. I think the connection thing is really important, because you're absolutely right. With trauma disconnects. It disconnects us interpersonally, and it also disconnects us from ourselves. And anything that can help us to reconnect with ourselves is actually really important, particularly if you're, and there'll be people watching this who are just, the light bulbs are going on with the disconnection thing. And sometimes, you know, folks think that the only route to that is to do intensive therapy for however many years and unearth all of your stuff and all the rest of it. But in actual fact, we know here that that's not the case. That sometimes it's the simplest things, like coming to a choir and singing, or coming to you know, something that you connect as a group, or the reconnection stuff in terms of your own physical reconnection with yourself, that makes a world of a difference.
Yeah, and I hear stories all the time of how that plays out. At the end of last term, I had a number of conversations and cards and letters from people who their basic message was, singing is saving my life right now. And that sounds massive, but actually, like, it actually gives me the goosebumps to say it, because that's not because I'm super brilliant at what I do. It's because what we do together creates change, creates connection, and brings people back to themselves, and they go, oh, I've forgotten me. Like, we'll remember that whole, if you break the word down, we remember, we like bring ourselves back in. And I think that's what both of these things do, really.
So that whole remember word is the opposite of dismember. So when you dismember, you take it apart. When you remember, you put it back together again, which is often what I would certainly talk to clients about. So then, I mean, we ask people who come in our podcast the same question every time. That's where we land. So that magical question then, if you had a magic wand that you could wave, and I think the trajectory of the conversation, we might know where this is going, but if you had a magic wand that you could wave, that you could change something in our society or culture that would massively impact mental health or emotional health for the good, what would it be?
I think it would be around enabling people to love their bodies and really be inside their bodies. There's so much in culture about, especially as women, but not limited to women, but about being the right shape and the right size, and the world wants to shrink us down and make us smaller and make us diet and all that kind of stuff.